I signed the adoption papers for a newborn girl when I was 28 years old. I was single. I lived in a cramped apartment near Forsyth Park. My mother told me I was making the biggest mistake of my life. She did not offer me support. She offered me a letter of severance. 13 years later, my daughter stood at a middle school graduation podium and read that exact letter to 300 people. Welcome to Maya Tells Stories. Please drop your age and the city you are listening from in the comments below so we can connect. My name is Aubrey. I am a forensic accountant working in Savannah, Georgia. I spend my days tracing hidden assets and unraveling corporate deceit. Before the letter arrived, and before my family fractured, I was buried in a complicated embezzlement case. It was a Tuesday in late July. The coastal humidity pressed against the glass windows of my downtown office. The air conditioning unit rattled. It struggled to keep the room cool. I sat at my desk staring at a printed ledger. The numbers told a story of theft. A prominent local maritime charity was bleeding capital. The executive director had siphoned funds through a series of dummy corporations registered in Delaware. It was a calculated violation of the Bank Secrecy Act. I traced a recurring transfer of $42,000. The money moved every second Thursday of the month into an offshore trust. I highlighted the routing anomaly with a yellow marker. My paralegal Jillian pushed open my glass door. She carried a thick manila folder under her right arm. Jillian is a Savannah native with a sharp legal mind and zero tolerance for nonsense. She dropped the folder onto my desk. She tapped her index finger on a specific line item showing a falsified vendor invoice. We had them trapped in their own financial maze. The heavy black phone on my desk began to ring. The caller identification displayed the main routing number for the Chatham County Division of Family and Children's Services. My stomach dropped. I had spent 2 grueling years navigating the state adoption system. I submitted background checks, I provided financial disclosures, and I underwent invasive home inspections. The system was severely backlogged. I picked up the receiver. A caseworker named Sarah spoke in a rushed, exhausted tone. She told me a newborn girl had been surrendered at a local clinic 3 days prior. The county was out of emergency foster beds. They needed an immediate placement. Sarah asked if I was ready. I looked at the complicated embezzlement ledger sitting in front of me. I looked at Jillian standing across the room. I told Sarah I would take the baby. Jillian let out a sharp sigh. She closed the office door and leaned against the glass partition. She reminded me that the state maintenance stipends under Title IV-E were perpetually delayed. The local bureaucracy was a nightmare. She calculated my current salary against the high cost of infant care in a matter of seconds. She stated I lacked the financial bandwidth to support a child alone while working grueling corporate hours. She was relying entirely on clinical logic. She told me I was walking into a financial trap that would stall my career trajectory. I felt a sudden flash of defensive anger. The exhaustion of the audit and the terror of the phone call collided. I snapped at her. I told her to mind her own legal cases and stop treating my life like a bankruptcy filing. It was an unfair reaction. I raised my voice at the only person in the building who genuinely cared about my survival. Jillian did not argue. She gave me a long, quiet look and walked out of the office. I felt a wave of immediate regret. I did not have time to apologize. I grabbed my car keys and walked out of the building. I left the maritime fraud case unresolved on my desk. I walked into the concrete parking garage. The thick coastal heat hit me like a physical wall. I unlocked my sedan and started the engine. My hands gripped the steering wheel tight enough to make my joints ache. My cell phone vibrated in the passenger seat. The screen displayed my mother's name. Brenda grew up in a trailer park in Waycross, Georgia. She spent her entire adult life clawing her way into Savannah high society. She married my father, William, to secure financial stability and erase her past destitution. She possessed deep connections within the local historical society network. She collected local gossip before it became public record. I knew she had already heard about the county placement. I knew this phone call would force a reckoning. I put the car in drive and answered the call. The line connected, and my mother's voice filled the small space of my sedan. Brenda did not waste breath on a greeting. She told me to drive to her house on Ardsley Park immediately. Her tone was flat and clipped. She stated she knew about the county foster placement and we needed to discuss my future before I finalized any legal documents. I told her I was already on my way to the agency. She cut me off. She said if I signed those papers without looking her in the eye, I would cease to be her daughter. The call ended with a sharp click. I sat at a red light on Abercorn Street watching the heat waves distort the pavement. My chest felt hollow. I was a forensic accountant accustomed to high-stakes corporate warfare. I routinely deposed aggressive executives hiding millions in offshore accounts. Yet a 10-second phone call from a woman who prioritized country club newsletters over her own child left me breathless. I turned the steering wheel and redirected my route toward the historic district. My parents lived in a restored Victorian home shaded by enormous live oak trees dripping with Spanish moss. The neighborhood was a fortress of old Southern money. Brenda had spent 3 decades fortifying her position within this zip code. I parked my reliable sedan behind a line of luxury European vehicles. I walked up the brick pathway, carrying the thin, yellow folder holding my preliminary adoption approval. I opened the heavy mahogany front door. The air conditioning washed over me, along with the clinking of fine crystal and the low hum of polite conversation. Brenda was hosting the monthly Savannah Historical Society luncheon. The formal dining room was filled with women wearing pastel dresses and pearl necklaces. They were the gatekeepers of local social capital. My mother stood at the head of the long dining table holding a silver pitcher of iced tea. She wore a tailored linen dress. Her hair was styled into an immaculate blonde bob. She saw me standing in the foyer holding a state-issued folder. I expected a public confrontation. I braced myself for the theatrical outrage she usually deployed when her authority was challenged. Brenda did not scream. She did not drop the silver pitcher. She offered a tight, polite smile to the society women and excused herself. She walked toward me with measured, deliberate steps. She took my elbow and guided me down the hallway and into the pristine, white marble kitchen. She pushed the swinging door shut. The heavy wood dampened the sound of the luncheon. We were alone. Brenda released my arm and leaned against the granite counter. She looked at the yellow folder in my hands. I told her the agency had a newborn girl. I told her I was taking the placement and starting the final legal process. I waited for the eruption. Instead, she crossed her arms and let out a long, ragged sigh. The polished facade she presented to the dining room cracked just enough to reveal the terrified woman underneath. She did not insult me. She lowered her voice to a hoarse whisper. She asked me if I remembered the stories about Waycross. I stared at her. Waycross was a rural logging town deep in the Georgia swamps. It was the place my mother spent her childhood trying to escape. She told me about the rusted trailer she grew up in. She described the feeling of wearing damp clothes to school because her family could not afford a dryer. She spoke about the humiliation of standing in line for government cheese while the local merchants looked at her mother with undisguised pity. Brenda looked at the adoption folder and told me poverty is not just a lack of money. She called it a disease that sticks to your skin. She stated she had spent her entire life scrubbing that dirt off her hands. She married my father, William, because he offered her a shield. William was a commercial underwriter with a steady income and a respectable family name. She used his stability to build a fortress. She told me she curated every aspect of our lives to ensure we would never be looked down upon by the women sitting in the next room. She pointed a manicured finger at the yellow folder. She said a single woman adopting a ward of the state is a direct path back to the bottom. She claimed the foster system is full of broken biology and inherited trauma. Her words were cruel, but they were rooted in a deep, agonizing fear. She genuinely believed my decision would drag our entire family back into the social destitution she had barely survived. She viewed the innocent newborn at the clinic not as a child, but as a toxic financial and social liability. I stood in the sterile kitchen feeling a suffocating mix of frustration and class anxiety. I understood her trauma, but I refused to let her weaponize it against an abandoned infant. I told her my career in forensic accounting provided me with enough capital to support a family. I explained that I was not a helpless child in a rural swamp. I was an educated professional making a deliberate choice. The swinging door pushed open before she could reply. My father walked into the kitchen carrying an empty serving tray. William was a quiet, passive man who treated domestic conflict the same way he treated high-risk insurance policies. He avoided it entirely. He saw the yellow folder in my hands and the rigid posture of his wife. He stopped walking. I looked at my father and asked for his support. I asked him to tell Brenda that building a family is not a financial transaction. William looked down at the tile floor. He set the serving tray on the island and took a step backward. He told me I needed to listen to my mother. He muttered an excuse about checking the patio and slipped back out the door. He chose the path of least resistance. He loved me, but he feared his wife's social wrath far more than he valued his own moral compass. His retreat left me entirely isolated. Brenda watched him leave and turned back to me. The brief moment of vulnerability was gone. Her posture stiffened. She became the matriarch of the Historical Society once again. She delivered her ultimatum with chilling clarity. She told me the women in the dining room dictated the local business connections in Chatham County. She warned me that raising a foster child alone would turn me into a social pariah. She stated she would not allow my reckless charity project to undo 30 years of her hard work. I felt a cold, heavy knot form in my chest. I realized no amount of logic or financial proof would bridge the divide between us. She was trapped in her own history. I tightened my grip on the yellow folder. I told her I was going to the clinic to meet my daughter. I turned around and walked out of the kitchen. I navigated back down the hallway. The Historical Society women paused their conversations to watch me leave. I did not offer them a goodbye. I walked out the heavy mahogany door and stepped back into the suffocating coastal heat. I drove to the county agency and signed the preliminary placement documents. I held the newborn girl for the first time in a small, sterile clinic room. She had dark hair and quiet, observant eyes. I named her Harper. I brought her home to my cramped apartment. I set up a secondhand crib and prepared for the grueling reality of single motherhood. I thought the worst of the family conflict was over. I assumed Brenda would simply ignore us and focus on her social calendar. I underestimated her need to formally sever the perceived liability. A few days later, the mail carrier dropped a thick envelope into my metal mailbox, and the true cost of my decision arrived on heavy cream paper. The first 3 days with Harper blurred into a grueling cycle of exhaustion. I lived in a state of perpetual motion inside my cramped apartment. I boiled bottles on a tiny electric stove and paced the worn hardwood floors, holding a fragile newborn. The coastal Georgia summer pressed against the thin window panes. The air was thick and unyielding. I had taken an emergency unpaid leave of absence from my accounting firm to manage the sudden placement. My career, tracing hidden corporate assets, felt like a distant memory. My entire world shrank to the size of a secondhand crib and a stack of county foster documents. I thought the physical exhaustion would be the hardest part of single motherhood. I was wrong. The true test of my endurance arrived on a Thursday afternoon through the postal service. I carried Harper downstairs to the lobby of my building. The metal mailboxes lined the peeling plaster wall. I unlocked my box and pulled out a stack of past-due utility bills and local grocery advertisements. Hidden between the generic mailers was a single, thick envelope. I recognized the stationery instantly. It was heavy cream cardstock. The top left corner bore an embossed monogram. It was the exact premium paper my mother Brenda used for her historical society invitations and formal thank you notes. The envelope carried a physical weight that made my stomach turn. I did not open it in the lobby. I walked back up the stairs with Harper resting against my shoulder. I unlocked my apartment door and set the mail on the small kitchen table. I laid Harper down in her crib. She fell asleep to the hum of a cheap, oscillating fan. I walked back to the kitchen and picked up the heavy cream envelope. I slid my thumb under the sealed flap and pulled out a single folded sheet of matching paper. The handwriting was meticulous, perfect cursive. Brenda did not use harsh profanity or loud insults. She utilized the passive, polite communication style perfected by Southern high society. She delivered brutal devastation, wrapped in polite syntax. The letter stated that my choice to bring a ward of the state into my home was an insurmountable betrayal. She wrote that she had spent 30 years building a respectable lineage for our family. She claimed my reckless charity project had permanently tainted that lineage. The words were clinical and detached. She did not refer to Harper as a child or a granddaughter. She referred to her as a persistent liability. The final paragraph delivered the ultimate verdict. Brenda wrote that since I had chosen to abandon my social obligations, I was no longer entitled to the privileges of the family. She formally requested that I stop using their Ardsley Park address for any correspondence. She stated I was no longer welcome at their home for holidays or Sunday dinners. She officially revoked my status as her daughter. I read the cursive lines 3 times. My chest felt hollow. A secondary piece of paper slipped from the fold of the letter and fluttered onto the laminate kitchen table. I looked down at the table. It was a formal cashier's check, drawn from my father's primary commercial bank. The amount printed across the center was $10,000. I looked at the memo line printed in the bottom corner. The ink clearly spelled out the words, "Final Severance." Brenda and William were treating me like a terminated corporate employee. They were attempting to buy their way out of parental guilt. They calculated that $10,000 was the exact price of a clean conscience. It was hush money, designed to keep me away from their pristine neighborhood. I am a forensic accountant. My entire profession is based on rational financial logic. I understand the precise value of liquid capital. $10,000 was a profound safety net. It represented 6 months of rent in my current building. It meant premium infant formula, a reliable daycare deposit, and a strong buffer against the crushing cost of unexpected pediatric bills. It was the exact amount of money I desperately needed to survive my unpaid leave of absence. A logical woman would have deposited the check immediately and used the funds to secure her child's future. I was not a logical woman in that moment. I was a wounded, rejected daughter. A hot, blinding rage surged upward from my chest. It clouded my vision and drowned out all rational thought. I felt the decades of condescension and class anxiety my mother had forced upon me bubbling over. I picked up the cashier's check. My hands shook. I did not think about the impending utility bills or the rising cost of diapers. I only thought about the sheer humiliation of accepting a payout for my own exile. I gripped the thick paper and ripped it straight down the middle. The tearing sound was loud in the quiet kitchen. I placed the torn halves together and ripped them again. I shredded the $10,000 lifeline into tiny, useless confetti strips. I threw the pieces into the plastic garbage bin under the sink. I stood over the trash can, breathing heavily. The physical act of destruction offered a fleeting second of fierce vindication. I had rejected her dirty money. I had proven my independence. The adrenaline evaporated a few moments later. The room felt suddenly very cold, despite the stifling summer heat outside. Harper woke up in the other room and began to cry. The high-pitched wail cut through the silence. I walked to the refrigerator to prepare a bottle. I opened the door and saw the sparse shelves. I walked back to the kitchen counter and logged into my banking application on my phone. The digital display loaded the current balance of my checking account. The number staring back at me was $42.16. The adoption fees, the emergency legal filings, and the background check processing costs had drained my meager savings. I had relied on my next corporate paycheck to cover my upcoming rent, but my abrupt unpaid leave erased that income. I had assumed the state of Georgia would process my monthly foster care maintenance stipend immediately upon placement. I was deeply naive. I looked at the garbage bin. A cashier's check cannot be taped back together and deposited. The funds are drawn directly from the issuing bank rather than a personal account. The only way to replace a destroyed cashier's check is to have the original purchaser request a formal reissue from a branch manager. That would require calling my mother, admitting my reckless mistake, and begging for a second payout. That was an impossible option. I sank into one of the cheap wooden dining chairs. The crushing weight of my reality descended upon me. I had just committed financial suicide out of pure, stubborn spite. I was a professional who audited multi-million-dollar fraud cases, and I had just bankrupted my own household in 5 seconds. Harper continued to cry in the bedroom. Her voice echoed off the bare walls. I had no safety net left. I could not call my father William because he had already chosen to hide behind my mother's social ambitions. I could not call my paralegal friend Jillian because I had unfairly snapped at her and pushed her away during my panic at the office. I was 28 years old, holding a newborn infant with $42 to my name. The heavy cream letter sat on the table, mocking my predicament. Brenda had successfully severed the tether. I was entirely alone in a city that judged a woman solely by her familial connections and her financial standing. The Savannah heat pressed against the glass. I realized the true battle was not with my mother's historical society friends or her cruel cursive handwriting. The immediate threat was much more structural and unforgiving. I had to face the notorious government agencies of coastal Georgia to secure the basic resources needed to keep my daughter fed. If I failed to navigate the broken system, my child would suffer the immediate consequences of my pride. I spent the first week of August sitting in a molded plastic chair inside the Division of Family and Children's Services. The county office on Oglethorpe Avenue smelled like stale floor wax and administrative despair. I held Harper against my chest while I waited for my assigned number to be called over the crackling intercom system. The air conditioning in the waiting room was uneven. It left patches of cold air near the windows, while the center of the room felt stagnant and humid. I watched other exhausted parents navigate the maze of government paperwork. My name was eventually announced. I walked into a small cubicle divided by a gray fabric partition. The caseworker, Sarah, looked at her computer monitor and let out a long, heavy sigh. She rubbed her tired eyes and delivered the bureaucratic verdict. The Title IV-E maintenance payments were officially frozen for new placements. A regional funding dispute in the Georgia state legislature had caused a massive administrative bottleneck at the county level. She typed a few notes into her keyboard and told me the mandatory foster care stipend would take a minimum of 4 months to process and disperse. I stared at the beige linoleum floor beneath her desk. I was a professional auditor. I spent my career dissecting complex offshore trusts and tracing hidden corporate revenue streams. I knew exactly how to force a multinational corporation into financial compliance. I possessed absolutely zero leverage against a broken state welfare system. I walked out of the agency building with a sleeping infant strapped to my chest. The $42 remaining in my checking account was already gone. I had purchased a single box of generic diapers and a bulk container of baby formula from a local pharmacy. My apartment rent was due in exactly 11 days. The physical weight of sheer poverty settled over my shoulders. It was a suffocating pressure that made my vision blur. I looked at my reliable silver sedan parked along the cracked sidewalk. It was my only remaining liquid asset. I strapped Harper into her car seat and drove directly to a sprawling used car lot on Abercorn Street. The lot manager was a pragmatic man who understood the geometry of desperation. He saw an exhausted woman holding a baby and offered me less than half the actual market value of the vehicle. I did not attempt to negotiate a better rate. I did not have the luxury of time or pride. I signed the vehicle title transfer on the hood of the car and walked away with a thick stack of $100 bills in a bank envelope. The cash covered my rent and utilities for the next 3 months. It kept a secure roof over Harper's head. It also permanently trapped me in a city built entirely for automobiles. Savannah is not designed for pedestrians. The coastal summer heat acts as a physical weight that pushes down on your lungs. The humidity hangs in the thick air and coats your skin in a perpetual layer of sweat. I became entirely dependent on the Chatham Area Transit System to navigate the sprawling coastal landscape. The local public bus schedules were notoriously unreliable. I spent hours standing on cracked concrete sidewalks with absolutely no shade from the relentless sun. I carried a heavy canvas diaper bag over my left shoulder. I balanced Harper's rigid plastic car seat in my right hand. The cheap plastic handle dug deeply into my palm and left dark red indentations across my skin. Every trip to the grocery store or the pediatric clinic became a grueling test of my physical endurance. Late August brought a relentless heat wave that pushed the local temperature past 100 degrees. I'd spent 2 hours at a downtown charity pantry securing a discounted box of infant formula and basic supplies. I stood at an exposed bus stop on Montgomery Street, waiting for the southbound route. The sun beat down on the black asphalt and radiated heat directly upward. Harper began to cry. It was not a soft infant whimper. It was a shrill, piercing scream, born of absolute physical discomfort and coastal heat. I rocked her car seat back and forth against my legs, but the repetitive motion did nothing to soothe her distress. The transit vehicle arrived 24 minutes behind schedule. The hydraulic doors hissed open and released a wave of hot air. The air conditioning inside the cabin was completely broken. The interior air was stagnant and smelled heavily of diesel exhaust fumes and damp clothing. I climbed the steep rubber steps, dragging the heavy car seat and the cardboard box of formula. The bus driver was an older man wearing a sweat-stained uniform shirt. He looked at the screaming infant and let out a loud, irritated groan. He muttered a passive-aggressive comment about careless people bringing noisy problems onto his public route. He tapped his thick fingers against the large steering wheel and told me to hurry up and find a seat before he closed the hydraulic doors on my bag. The combination of extreme heat and relentless sleep deprivation snapped my last remaining tether of emotional control. The polite professional demeanor I utilized in corporate boardrooms completely vanished. I dropped the heavy cardboard box of formula onto the textured rubber floor. I looked directly into the eyes of the transit driver. I raised my voice and yelled at him with absolute raw fury. I did not use carefully constructed logical arguments. I screamed that I was trying to keep a child alive in a broken city, and he needed to shut his mouth and drive the vehicle. I projected my voice so loudly that the other passengers sitting in the front rows physically flinched. My chest heaved as I glared at the man. He stared back at me in stunned silence. He did not utter another word. He put the heavy vehicle in gear and pulled away from the curb. I gathered my cardboard box and stumbled down the narrow center aisle. I found an empty plastic seat near the rear exit doors. I set the heavy car seat on my lap and wrapped my arms around it. Harper continued to wail into the stagnant air. I leaned my head against the vibrating glass window. The sudden surge of defensive adrenaline faded instantly. A crushing wave of deep humiliation took its place. I felt the eyes of the other passengers burning into my back. I had completely lost my composure in a public space. I had directed my profound frustration at a working-class driver who was likely just as miserable in the broken transit vehicle as I was. It was an ugly, imperfect emotional outburst. It was the exact type of unhinged, erratic behavior my mother Brenda always claimed I would exhibit if I stepped outside her curated social fortress. I closed my eyes and let the rhythmic bouncing of the transit vehicle lull Harper into a fitful, exhausted sleep. The thick envelope of cash from my car sale was rapidly dwindling. The downtown charity pantries were a temporary patch over a gaping financial wound. I could not endure another 3 months of waiting for the state bureaucracy to function. The severe isolation and the crushing poverty were actively destroying my emotional stability. I realized my sheer, stubborn endurance was no longer a viable survival strategy. I needed steady, reliable capital to protect my daughter. I had to swallow the last remaining shreds of my foolish pride and return to the corporate environment I had abruptly abandoned. I needed to walk back into my downtown forensic accounting firm and beg the senior partners for my position. I knew my return would thrust me directly into the crosshairs of the unresolved maritime embezzlement case. The massive corporate fraud I had left sitting on my desk was waiting for me. The perpetrators were actively burying their financial tracks while I rode the city bus. My decision to return to the firm would pit my desperate need for a paycheck against a dangerous network of corporate criminals. I walked into the downtown accounting firm on a humid Tuesday morning. I wore a tailored suit that hung slightly loose on my exhausted frame. I did not beg the senior partners for my position. I presented a mathematical proposition. I stood in the central conference room and told them the maritime charity embezzlement case was rotting on my desk. I reminded them the firm was bleeding billable hours while the perpetrators buried their tracks. I offered to close the complex audit in 2 weeks in exchange for my immediate reinstatement and a substantial performance bonus. They agreed to the terms because corporate greed always supersedes administrative grudges. I dragged a portable bassinet into my office. Harper slept under my heavy wooden desk while I hunted the missing capital. The executive director of the charity had layered his theft through multiple domestic holding companies. It was a sophisticated labyrinth designed to exhaust standard regulatory audits. I was not conducting a standard audit. I was a mother fighting for basic survival. The sheer desperation sharpened my focus. I stayed at the office until midnight, running predictive algorithms against the banking logs. I drank bitter black coffee and stared at the glowing monitor until my vision blurred. The breakthrough occurred on a Friday evening. I traced a long string of microtransactions bouncing between regional Georgia banks. The perpetrator used fractional deposits to avoid triggering the $10,000 reporting threshold mandated by the Bank Secrecy Act. The fragmented funds eventually funneled into a single corporate routing number. I ran a diagnostic trace on the receiving institution. The digital footprint led directly to a sheltered trust in the Cayman Islands. I had pierced the corporate veil. The definitive proof of federal fraud sat right there on my screen. I printed the final ledger and reached down to pick up my daughter. Harper felt unnaturally warm. I pressed the back of my hand against her forehead. Her skin radiated a dry, intense heat. Her breathing sounded shallow and ragged. The thick, damp coastal air had settled deep into her lungs. A severe respiratory infection was rapidly taking hold. The triumph of solving the financial puzzle evaporated in a fraction of a second. I grabbed my car keys and the heavy canvas diaper bag. I drove straight to the pediatric emergency room at Memorial Health. The fluorescent lights in the waiting area buzzed with a chaotic energy. I held Harper tightly while a triage nurse recorded her vital signs. The medical staff rushed her into an examination room to administer immediate oxygen and intravenous fluids. I stood in the corner of the sterile room, watching the clear liquid drip into her tiny arm. The terror of losing her paralyzed me. I leaned against the cold tile wall and forgot how to breathe. I was a professional who dismantled corporate criminals, but I was powerless against a pediatric fever. The attending physician stabilized her breathing after 3 agonizing hours. He assured me she would recover, but required an overnight observation stay. The immediate medical panic subsided. The bureaucratic terror took its place. A hospital administration clerk walked into the room carrying a plastic clipboard. She handed me a preliminary intake form. She asked for my primary insurance provider. My abrupt unpaid leave had triggered a temporary lapse in my corporate health coverage. I looked at the blank insurance field on the paper. The pediatric stay would generate a crushing invoice. The medical debt threatened to erase the tentative stability I had just secured. Jillian arrived at the hospital an hour later. She carried 2 cups of black coffee and a thick stack of legal documents. I had called her from the triage waiting room in a moment of sheer panic. Jillian grew up navigating the tangled healthcare networks of coastal Georgia. She possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of regional hospital protocols. She saw the intake clipboard resting on the plastic bedside table. She did not offer me a sympathetic hug. She picked up the clipboard and walked directly out of the room to locate the billing supervisor. Jillian spent 40 minutes in the administrative wing. She utilized her sharp paralegal negotiation tactics. She argued with the billing department over uninsured self-pay discounts and mandatory charity care adjustments. She forced the hospital to reclassify the emergency admission under a specialized regional pediatric grant designed for sudden foster placements. She returned to the examination room and handed me a revised invoice. She had reduced the crushing medical debt to a manageable fraction of the original cost. She set the coffee on the table and told me to focus on my daughter instead of the paperwork. I submitted the final maritime embezzlement report to the senior partners the following morning from a rigid plastic chair in the hospital cafeteria. The definitive evidence of the offshore trust triggered an immediate federal investigation. The firm secured a large settlement fee from the charity board of directors. The senior partners honored my contract. A substantial performance bonus was wired directly into my checking account by the end of the business day. I walked to the hospital cashier window and paid Harper's medical bill in full. I did not use a credit card. I used the exact capital I had extracted from a corrupt executive. The transaction felt like a profound structural victory. I had utilized my specific professional skills to shield my daughter from financial ruin. We returned to the cramped apartment 2 days later. The air conditioning unit still rattled, and the coastal heat remained unforgiving. I laid Harper in her crib and watched her chest rise and fall with healthy, steady breaths. The extreme desperation of our first few months together began to recede. I settled into a grueling but functional routine. I balanced high-stakes forensic accounting with the quiet, relentless demands of motherhood. The state maintenance stipends eventually materialized after weeks of regional delays. I slowly rebuilt my depleted savings account. We survived the initial storm entirely on our own merit. I believed I had successfully isolated us from my toxic family ecosystem. I assumed my mother Brenda and my father William were permanent ghosts from a past life. They had made their choice clear with the torn severance check and the heavy cream letter. I focused all my energy on raising my daughter and tracking fraudulent ledgers. I underestimated the persistence of silent guilt. The quiet peace of our survival was a fragile illusion. Someone had been watching us from the periphery of the historic district. An unexpected shadow would soon step out from beneath the canopy of Spanish moss to disrupt our tentative stability. The chaotic, frantic energy of Harper's infancy gave way to the steady, rhythmic pulse of her childhood. 7 years passed in a blur of forensic audits and elementary school drop-offs. We established a quiet, resilient life in Savannah. Harper was an incredibly sharp child. She possessed an intense focus and a quiet, observational nature. She spent many late evenings sitting on the floor of my office, coloring with crayons, while I analyzed complex corporate tax returns. I secured a promotion to senior forensic investigator at my firm. I moved us out of the cramped apartment and into a modest brick house on the edge of the historic district. We had built a secure fortress using only my professional income. My parents remained entirely absent. Brenda never sent a birthday card. William never called to ask about his granddaughter. They maintained their curated social facade in Ardsley Park, while we thrived in their blind spot. Every Saturday morning, Harper and I walked to Forsyth Park. It was our sacred weekly ritual. The massive green expanse in the center of the city offered a brief respite from the dense coastal humidity. The giant live oak trees stretched their heavy branches across the walkways. The thick Spanish moss draped down like gray curtains. It created pools of deep shade against the blinding Georgia sun. Harper usually ran ahead to the playground while I sat on an iron bench near the ornate white fountain. I used those quiet moments to drink black coffee and mentally map out my upcoming legal cases. The park felt safe. It was a neutral, public ground, far removed from the strict social hierarchies of my mother's country club circle. On a Saturday in early October, the crisp autumn air finally pushed the summer heat away. I sat on my usual bench, watching Harper navigate the wooden climbing structure. She wore a bright yellow jacket that made her easy to spot among the other children. I felt a profound sense of tentative peace. We had survived the grueling early years. My bank account was stable. The crushing isolation had transformed into a fierce, protective independence. I reached into my bag to retrieve a physical copy of a bank ledger. I needed to review a suspicious offshore wire transfer before Monday morning. I heard the crunch of gravel on the walkway behind me. The heavy footsteps slowed and stopped near the edge of my bench. I looked up from the printed numbers. My father stood a few feet away. William had aged significantly in 7 years. His posture was slightly stooped. The crisp, tailored suits he used to wear were replaced by a faded gray cardigan. He looked like a man carrying an invisible, crushing weight. He did not offer a wide smile or open his arms for a dramatic reunion. He stood nervously in the shade of the live oak tree and glanced around the park. He was checking to see if anyone from the local historical society was watching him. He was terrified of being seen with his exiled daughter. He sat down on the far edge of the iron bench. He kept a deliberate physical distance between us. He looked toward the playground and watched Harper climbing the wooden stairs. He asked me how she was doing. His voice was quiet and thin. I stared at him. The man who had walked out of the kitchen and abandoned me to my mother's wrath was now sitting in a public park asking about a child he had never met. I did not scream at him. I did not create a public scene. The white-hot anger I felt 7 years ago had burned down to cold, clinical detachment. I answered him with a flat, factual tone. I told him Harper was 7 years old. I stated she was healthy and exceptionally bright. William nodded slowly. He reached his hand inside his gray cardigan and pulled out a thick white envelope. He rested it on his knee. He kept his eyes fixed on the playground. He told me he knew about the struggles we faced during the first few years. He admitted he knew about the delayed state stipends and my desperate sale of the silver sedan. He had been quietly monitoring my survival from a safe, cowardly distance. He tapped his finger against the white envelope. He stated it contained the legal routing documents for a restricted educational trust fund. He had bypassed my mother's strict financial control and funneled a portion of his commercial underwriting bonuses into a hidden account. The trust was designed to mature when Harper turned 18. It held enough capital to cover her entire undergraduate tuition at an elite university. He slid the envelope across the iron slats of the bench. He offered it to me. He then delivered the fatal condition. He looked at me with deep, fearful eyes. He told me Brenda could never know about the money. He stated his marriage would not survive the social fallout if she discovered he was secretly funding the child she had formally severed from the family lineage. He demanded absolute silence. He was offering a massive financial gift wrapped in a toxic blanket of deception. He wanted to purchase his redemption while remaining safely hidden in the shadows. He wanted to be a grandfather in secret while acting like a stranger in public. I looked at the thick white envelope resting on the bench. I am a forensic accountant. I calculate the long-term trajectory of hidden assets every single day. I knew the exact value of a fully funded educational trust. I knew it would erase the crushing burden of future student loan debt for my daughter. It was an incredibly logical financial mechanism. I also knew the psychological cost of accepting dirty capital. If I took the envelope, I would be validating his cowardice. I would be teaching Harper that our family value was a dirty secret to be hidden from the Historical Society women. I would be engaging in the exact same financial manipulation my mother used when she offered me the torn severance check. My pride flared up. It was an ugly, stubborn emotion. It was the same fierce instinct that caused me to rip up $10,000 in a cramped kitchen 7 years ago. I did not reach for the envelope. I picked up my coffee cup and looked directly at my father. I told him my daughter was not an illicit charity project to be funded in the dark. I stated that if he lacked the spine to claim her publicly, he did not possess the right to fund her privately. I told him Harper would attend college using the capital I earned tracing corporate fraud. We did not need his hidden guilt money to secure her future. William flinched as if I had struck him. He pulled his hand back from the envelope. He realized I would not provide him with a clean, easy absolution. He picked up the heavy white paper and slid it back inside his cardigan. He stood up from the iron bench. He did not argue. He simply nodded and walked away down the gravel path. He disappeared back into the thick shadows of the live oak trees. I watched him retreat to the safety of Ardsley Park. I felt a sharp pang of regret mixed with my stubborn vindication. I had just rejected a massive financial safety net for my daughter to protect my own ego. I had allowed my deep-seated anger toward my parents to dictate a purely economic decision. I called Harper over from the playground. We walked back to our brick house, holding hands. The brief encounter in Forsyth Park confirmed that my family was still actively orbiting our lives. The heavy wall I had built between us was porous. William had proven they were watching us. I pushed the encounter to the back of my mind. I focused on my demanding corporate career and my daughter's upcoming transition to a rigorous academic environment. I believed my sheer professional competence would continue to shield Harper from the toxic social dynamics of Savannah. I assumed her sharp intelligence would command respect in any classroom. I failed to recognize that middle school in coastal Georgia is a ruthless battlefield where wealth and lineage dictate survival. A new, devastating conflict was about to erupt inside the sterile hallways of her elite academy. The collision would force me to choose between my hard-earned professional reputation and my daughter's dignity. Harper entered the 7th grade at a premier public magnet academy in downtown Savannah. The school was a coveted institution. It boasted elite academic metrics and advanced placement tracks. It also served as a social sorting mechanism for the wealthy coastal elite. The student body was heavily populated by the children of prominent local attorneys, corporate executives, and Historical Society board members. It was the exact demographic my mother Brenda spent her life courting. We had secured Harper's seat purely through her exceptional standardized test scores. My professional salary afforded us a comfortable life, but we did not possess the generational wealth or the inherited social capital that defined the academy culture. Harper navigated the polished hallways wearing generic retail clothing, while her peers wore imported designer brands. She did not complain about the stark economic disparity. Harper possessed a fierce, quiet intelligence. She preferred the solitude of the school library over the chaotic social dynamics of the cafeteria. She read advanced textbooks and ignored the whispered gossip that circulated among the affluent students. I assumed her intellectual isolation shielded her from the cruelty of her classmates. I believed my own ability to detach from emotional warfare had successfully transferred to my daughter. I was deeply mistaken. The social hierarchy of a Savannah middle school is an unforgiving ecosystem. It punishes anyone who fails to conform to the established lineage. Harper's lack of a traditional family structure and her quiet confidence made her an immediate target for the children of the elite. The breaking point occurred on a Tuesday afternoon in early November. I was sitting in a high-stakes mediation room negotiating a massive corporate settlement for a client. My cell phone vibrated violently against the heavy mahogany table. I glanced at the glowing screen. The caller identification displayed the main office number for Harper's Academy. A call from the principal during active instructional hours never signals good news. I requested a brief recess from the opposing counsel. I stepped into the quiet hallway and answered the phone. The school administrator spoke with a tight, clipped tone. She informed me that Harper had been involved in a serious physical altercation in the cafeteria. She stated my daughter had assaulted another student and was currently sitting in the disciplinary office awaiting suspension. I left the corporate mediation unresolved. I drove my car through the historic district with reckless speed. The defensive anger I had suppressed for 7 years ignited instantly. I walked into the main office of the academy wearing a tailored suit and a hostile expression. I found Harper sitting in a rigid plastic chair near the administrative desk. Her knuckles were bruised, and a small cut above her eyebrow was actively bleeding. She did not look terrified or remorseful. She stared straight ahead with a cold, defiant glare. The principal emerged from her private office, holding a formal disciplinary file. She asked me to step inside to discuss the expulsion protocols. She did not offer Harper a glass of water or medical attention. She treated my daughter like a violent liability. I sat across from the principal. She was a stern woman who prioritized the academy reputation over the well-being of the students. She delivered the official narrative. She claimed Harper had engaged in an unprovoked attack against a classmate named Madison. She highlighted Madison's pristine academic record and her parents' prominent status within the local historical society. The principal stated the school had a zero-tolerance policy for physical violence. She handed me a suspension notice and heavily implied that transferring Harper to a different district would be the most graceful exit strategy. I looked at the printed document. I did not sign it. I asked for the specific details of the provocation. The principal sighed and adjusted her glasses. She reluctantly admitted that an argument had occurred prior to the physical contact. She tried to minimize the context. I demanded the exact words. The principal shifted uncomfortably in her leather chair. She stated Madison had discovered Harper's adoption records. Madison had stood up in the crowded cafeteria and publicly mocked Harper. She told the entire lunchroom that Harper's biological parents did not want her, and her adoptive mother was just collecting state welfare checks. Madison weaponized the cruelest stereotypes of the foster care system to publicly humiliate my daughter. Harper had not engaged in a random act of violence. She had delivered a fierce physical response to a brutal psychological assault. The defensive fury in my chest crystallized into a sharp tactical strategy. I recognized the underlying social mechanics immediately. The principal was attempting to protect the child of a wealthy donor while discarding a student who lacked institutional leverage. I pushed the suspension notice back across the desk. I informed the principal that I was a senior forensic investigator who routinely dismantled corrupt corporate networks. I told her I would not allow her to expel my daughter for defending her own dignity against malicious harassment. I stated that if she pushed the expulsion forward, I would demand a full public hearing before the Chatham County School Board. I warned her that I would subpoena the cafeteria security footage. I promised to place Madison's unhinged verbal abuse into the public record. I told the principal I would force the school board to evaluate why the academy enabled the targeted bullying of adopted students while protecting the affluent aggressors. I threatened to turn a quiet disciplinary action into a massive public relations disaster that would threaten the magnet funding of the entire institution. The principal stared at me in stunned silence. She realized I was not an intimidated working-class mother she could easily bully. I was applying the exact same ruthless pressure I used against hostile corporate executives. I knew my aggressive stance was an imperfect emotional reaction. I was actively risking my professional reputation in Savannah. Threatening the school board meant alienating powerful local attorneys and business leaders who served on the administrative committees. Those were the exact individuals who hired my accounting firm for high-profile audits. I was jeopardizing my career trajectory to protect Harper's academic seat. It was a chaotic, messy escalation. I did not care. The principal recalculated the institutional risk. She withdrew the formal expulsion paperwork. She downgraded the punishment to a brief 3-day suspension for both students. She chose to bury the conflict rather than face a public tribunal. I walked out of the office and guided Harper toward the parking lot. We sat in my car in silence for several minutes. The adrenaline faded, leaving a heavy, exhausted tension in the small vehicle. I looked at the bruise forming on her knuckles. I asked her why she had not simply walked away from the cafeteria table. Harper looked out the passenger window. She told me she could handle the insults about her own background. She stated Madison had crossed the line when she insulted my ability to provide for her. Harper had thrown the punch to defend my honor, not her own. The realization struck me like a physical blow. My 13-year-old daughter had absorbed the intense pressure of our survival. She felt compelled to physically fight the local elite to prove our family was legitimate. I realized my fierce independence had inadvertently taught Harper that the world was a hostile battlefield. I had shielded her from my parents, but I had not protected her from the judgment of their social circle. The 3-day suspension forced us to remain home together. I attempted to return to a sense of normalcy by organizing my home office. I wanted to project a calm, stable environment to help Harper decompress. I pulled out a stack of old financial records to prepare for an upcoming tax audit. I failed to secure the locked filing cabinet in the corner of the room. A mundane administrative task was about to detonate a hidden psychological landmine. A piece of paper buried deep in my files was waiting to destroy the fragile peace we had just fought so hard to defend. The 3-day suspension forced an unnatural quiet upon our house. The chaotic rhythm of middle school drop-offs and corporate meetings was replaced by the low hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the hallway clock. I needed to maintain a sense of forward momentum to keep the defensive anger from consuming me. I decided to utilize the unexpected downtime to organize my personal financial records. The upcoming tax season required a meticulous audit of my own accounts. I am a forensic investigator. I demand the same rigorous compliance from myself that I extract from my clients. I walked into my home office and unlocked the heavy metal filing cabinet tucked into the corner. The cabinet held 13 years of survival. It contained the original foster care placement documents, the final adoption decrees, and the pediatric medical receipts I had paid using my first corporate bonus. It also held a single heavy cream envelope. I had never thrown the letter away. I kept my mother's cruel cursive handwriting buried beneath a stack of old tax returns. I did not keep it out of sentimental attachment or a secret desire for reconciliation. I kept it as a tactical reminder. It was the physical proof of why I could never rely on the social hierarchy of Savannah for protection. The letter was the foundational document of my fierce independence. I pulled several thick manila folders from the top drawer and carried them to my desk. I left the cabinet unlocked. I was deeply focused on reconciling a discrepancy in my quarterly tax estimates. I did not hear Harper walk down the hallway. I did not notice her standing in the doorway of the office. She had spent the morning reading a dense history textbook in the living room. The suspension had not diminished her intense academic focus. She walked into the office to ask me a question about a specific historical date. She stopped halfway across the room. Her eyes landed on the open filing cabinet. Harper possessed the same analytical nature I utilized in my career. She was naturally drawn to structured information. She saw a loose piece of paper sticking out from a secondary folder I had hastily shoved back into the drawer. It was the heavy cream envelope. The embossed monogram in the corner caught the overhead light. She reached out and pulled the envelope from the stack. I was staring intently at my computer monitor running a complex digital calculation. I was completely oblivious to the detonation occurring 3 feet behind me. Harper slid the folded letter from the envelope. She recognized the pristine cursive handwriting immediately. She had seen similar elegant script on the rare occasion Brenda sent a generic holiday card to a neighbor. Harper stood perfectly still in the center of the room. She read the first paragraph. She read the brutal assessment of her. She had seen similar elegant script on the rare occasion Brenda sent a generic holiday card to a neighbor. Harper stood perfectly still in the center of the room. She read the first paragraph. She read the brutal assessment of her own existence. She read the clinical description of her biological trauma being classified as a permanent liability to the family lineage. She read the final paragraph where her grandmother formally revoked my status as a daughter, simply because I chose to raise her. She read the postscript detailing the $10,000 severance check designed to purchase my silence. The silent dread in the room was absolute. A normal teenager would have gasped. A normal teenager would have screamed or thrown the paper across the desk and demanded an immediate explanation. Harper was not a normal teenager. She had spent her entire life watching me dismantle hostile adversaries with quiet, calculated precision. She had learned to process trauma internally before reacting externally. She did not make a sound. She did not alert me to her discovery. She absorbed the profound rejection written on the cream paper and converted the pain directly into a strategic asset. Harper turned around and walked silently out of the office, holding the letter. She moved down the hallway and entered the small utility room where I kept my secondary printer and copy machine. She placed the heavy cream paper onto the glass scanner bed. She pressed the copy button. The machine whirred quietly in the enclosed space. She waited for the replica to print. She folded the copy and slipped it into the pocket of her jeans. She walked back into my office with the original document. I was still typing rapidly on my keyboard, engaged in a frustrating tax calculation. She slid the original letter back into the envelope and placed it exactly where she had found it in the open drawer. She walked up to my desk and tapped me on the shoulder. She asked her history question with a perfectly neutral tone. Her face betrayed absolutely zero emotion. I answered her question and apologized for the messy state of the office. She nodded, grabbed her history textbook, and retreated to her bedroom. I closed the filing cabinet an hour later and locked it. I believed my secrets were safely secured in the metal drawer. I had no idea my 13-year-old daughter was currently sitting on her bed studying a photocopied manual of my family destruction. The suspension ended and Harper returned to the Magnet Academy. The atmosphere in the hallways was tense, but the physical harassment had ceased. The principal had clearly warned Madison and her affluent parents to maintain their distance to avoid a public school board tribunal. I assumed the crisis was averted. I returned my focus to my corporate accounting cases, believing the social friction of Savannah had been successfully managed. I did not realize Harper had shifted her focus entirely. She stopped engaging in petty cafeteria disputes. She was no longer interested in defending our honor against entitled middle school students. She had identified the true architect of our isolation. Harper spent the next 6 months executing a flawless academic campaign. She absorbed complex material with a terrifying intensity. She stayed up late studying advanced mathematics and literature. She volunteered for extra credit projects and dominated the regional debate competitions. She utilized the exact same relentless work ethic I used to trace hidden offshore accounts. I watched her academic trajectory with immense pride. I assumed she was driven by a natural intellectual curiosity. I failed to recognize the cold, calculated ambition fueling her performance. She was not studying to secure a bright future. She was studying to secure a highly specific public platform. The end of the academic year approached with rapid velocity. The coastal heat began to creep back into the Savannah air. The school administration began compiling the final grade point averages to determine the graduating honors. I was sitting in a deposition room downtown, interrogating a hostile corporate witness, when the academy called my cell phone. The principal requested a brief meeting. I braced myself for another disciplinary conflict. I assumed the fragile truce with the affluent families had finally fractured. I drove to the school preparing for another fierce defensive battle. I walked into the main office expecting hostility. The principal handed me an official, sealed envelope and delivered a reality I never anticipated. I sat across from the principal expecting a confrontation. I kept my posture rigid and my defensive arguments ready. The stern woman who had threatened to expel my daughter 6 months prior now offered me a tight, strained smile. She pushed the sealed envelope across the polished desk. She did not speak about cafeteria fights or wealthy donors. She informed me that the final academic tabulations were complete. She stated Harper had secured the highest cumulative grade point average in the history of the Magnet Academy. She told me my daughter was officially the valedictorian of the 8th grade graduating class. The pronouncement struck me with unexpected force. I stared at the sealed envelope. The defensive anger I had carried into the room dissolved instantly. A profound, guarded pride took its place. I thanked the principal and walked out to my car. I held the official notification in my hands. The crushing exhaustion of the early foster care days flashed through my mind. The delayed state stipends, the public transit nightmares, and the grueling late-night accounting audits had all coalesced into this single, undeniable victory. Harper had not just survived the vicious social hierarchy of a Savannah middle school, she had intellectually dominated it. I drove home feeling a rare sense of absolute triumph. I showed Harper the envelope that evening. She did not jump up and down or celebrate loudly. She read the formal letter, nodded her head, and returned to her homework. Her reaction was unnervingly calm. I attributed her quiet demeanor to her natural introverted personality. I had no idea she was merely confirming the successful completion of the first phase of her long-term strategy. The Academy published the valedictorian announcement the following week. The school administration routinely submitted academic honors to the Chatham County local newspaper. It was a standard public relations maneuver designed to highlight the prestige of the institution. The short article ran in the Sunday edition of the Savannah Morning News. It listed Harper's full name and her remarkable grade point average. It also listed me as her proud mother. The local paper was a mandatory read for the coastal elite. It was the primary source of community updates and business profiles. It was the exact publication my mother Brenda scoured every weekend to monitor the shifting social currents of the historic district. Brenda sat at her formal dining room table in Ardsley Park on a humid Sunday morning. She held the newspaper and a cup of expensive imported tea. She scanned the local achievements section, and her eyes locked onto our names. The daughter she had formally severed from the family lineage had just produced the top academic scholar in the city. The child she had labeled a toxic biological liability was now a publicly celebrated asset. The mathematical impossibility of our success shattered her established narrative. A normal estranged parent might have felt a twinge of regret or a sudden desire to apologize. Brenda did not operate on standard emotional logic. She operated purely on social capital. She stared at the valedictorian announcement and realized the severe reputational risk of her absence. The upcoming graduation ceremony would be heavily attended by the Historical Society board members and the wealthy local attorneys she courted. They would see Harper deliver the keynote address. They would see me sitting in the audience as a successful single professional. If Brenda and William were visibly missing from the premier academic event of the season, the local gossip network would immediately formulate their own conclusions. The coastal elite despise messy public estrangements. Brenda calculated that attending the ceremony and claiming credit for Harper's brilliant mind was far more advantageous than maintaining the silent exile. She decided to rewrite history. She intended to frame Harper's massive academic achievement as a direct result of the superior genetic lineage and rigorous work ethic of our family. She planned to attend the graduation and accept the congratulations of her peers as the proud, supportive grandmother. She needed to quickly bridge the 13-year gap of silence before the ceremony. She did not attempt to call my cell phone. She knew I would likely hang up on her. She utilized a more public and manipulative tactic. She targeted my professional sanctuary. I was sitting in my downtown office on a Wednesday afternoon, finalizing a corporate bankruptcy audit. Jillian walked into my office carrying a massive, elaborate floral arrangement. The heavy crystal vase was overflowing with white orchids and rare coastal lilies. It was an ostentatious display of wealth designed to command attention in a sterile corporate environment. Jillian set the heavy vase on my desk. Her expression was highly skeptical. She handed me a small embossed card tucked into the blooms. I recognized the heavy cream paper instantly. The card did not contain an apology or a request for a private conversation. The meticulous cursive handwriting simply stated how thrilled she was to read the newspaper announcement. She wrote that she and William had already secured premium seating for the graduation ceremony to support their brilliant granddaughter. She signed it with her formal name. The message was a tactical notification. She was not asking for an invitation. She was informing me of an impending invasion. She was unilaterally deciding to insert herself into the most important moment of my daughter's life to secure her own social standing. I stared at the white orchids. The guarded pride I felt earlier in the week morphed into a suffocating anxiety. I had spent over a decade building a massive fortress to protect Harper from this exact woman. Brenda had easily bypassed the walls with a newspaper article and a flower delivery. I knew confronting her would only trigger a massive public scene that would distract from Harper's achievement. I felt trapped by the social mechanics of Savannah. I decided to ignore the flowers and focus entirely on preparing Harper for her moment on the stage. I assumed the graduation would be a tense, uncomfortable exercise in avoiding eye contact with my parents. I believed my primary task was to shield Harper from their manipulative presence. I was completely unaware that my 13-year-old daughter had already prepared a massive counteroffensive, and I was about to become collateral damage in her carefully orchestrated ambush. The massive floral arrangement sat on my desk for 3 days before I threw it into the corporate dumpster. The impending reality of my parents attending the graduation cast a heavy shadow over the final weeks of the academic year. I focused on the practical logistics to distract myself from the looming collision. Harper needed a formal dress for the commencement ceremony. We drove to a boutique retail center on the south side of Savannah. The coastal heat was already oppressive by early May. The boutique was heavily air-conditioned and smelled of expensive perfume. We navigated the racks of pastel dresses. Harper was usually disinterested in formal clothing, but today she was highly specific. She selected a stark white tailored dress that looked more appropriate for a courtroom than a middle school graduation. It was rigid and professional. We stood near the fitting room mirrors while she checked the hemline. I asked her if she was nervous about delivering the valedictory address to 300 people. She smoothed the fabric of the dress and looked at my reflection in the mirror. Her brown eyes were completely calm. She told me she was not nervous at all. She stated she had been preparing for this specific speech for a very long time. I assumed she meant she had been practicing her delivery in front of her bedroom mirror. I smiled and paid for the dress. I drove us back toward the historic district feeling a surge of maternal affection. I believed I had successfully raised an incredibly poised young woman. The quiet drive home shifted when Harper turned away from the passenger window. She did not ask about dinner plans or her upcoming summer schedule. She asked a highly specific legal question. She inquired about the statutes regarding public disclosure and defamation in the state of Georgia. She asked if a person could be sued for reading a private communication in a public forum if the communication was factually accurate. The question was incredibly dense for a 13-year-old. I am a forensic accountant who frequently collaborates with corporate litigators. I am deeply familiar with civil liability laws. I assumed her inquiry was related to an advanced civics project or a final debate club assignment. I kept my eyes on the road and delivered a standard legal explanation. I told her that truth is the absolute defense against defamation claims. I explained that reading a verified document in public might violate social etiquette, but it rarely constitutes a civil crime unless it involves protected corporate trade secrets or classified government data. Harper nodded slowly. She processed the legal parameters with the silent intensity of an auditor reviewing a tax loophole. She asked one final clarifying question. She verified that a handwritten letter sent through the Federal Postal Service without a non-disclosure agreement was considered unprotected personal correspondence. I confirmed her assessment. She leaned back against the car seat and stared out the window. She did not ask anything else. I returned to my firm the following Monday morning to finalize the quarterly tax filings for my clients. Jillian walked into my office holding a fresh cup of coffee. She sat in the leather guest chair across from my desk. Jillian possesses a terrifying ability to read human behavior. She had spent the previous week watching me navigate the sudden arrival of my mother's floral arrangement. She knew the tension was escalating. She asked how the graduation preparations were progressing. I told her about the tailored white dress and the strange legal questions Harper had asked during the drive home. I mentioned the civics project assumption. Jillian stopped drinking her coffee. She set the ceramic mug down on my desk with a sharp clink. The casual, supportive demeanor vanished. She leaned forward and looked at me with an expression of intense alarm. She told me Harper was not working on a civics project. She bluntly stated that 13-year-old girls do not ask about the legal ramifications of reading private correspondence in public unless they possess private correspondence they intend to read in public. Jillian reminded me of the profound, quiet intelligence Harper utilized to survive the middle school cafeteria assault. She warned me that my daughter was actively planning a massive public detonation. I stared at Jillian across the desk. A cold knot formed in my stomach. The logic was undeniable. The bizarre legal inquiries and the rigid professional dress suddenly aligned into a terrifying tactical strategy. I thought about the locked filing cabinet in my home office. I remembered the afternoon during the 3-day suspension when I had left the drawers open while auditing my personal taxes. I realized I had left the heavy cream envelope exposed. Harper had been alone in the house with the foundational document of our family destruction. The silent dread I felt 6 months ago returned with staggering force. I left the corporate office and drove straight home. I walked into my office and unlocked the filing cabinet. I pulled out the secondary folders and found the heavy cream envelope. The pristine cursive handwriting was still there. The letter remained intact. I felt a brief surge of relief. I assumed Jillian had miscalculated the threat. I placed the envelope back into the drawer and locked the cabinet. I convinced myself the crisis was averted. I failed to comprehend the technological capabilities of my own child. I did not check the memory logs on the secondary scanner in the utility room. I did not realize the original document was merely a decoy. The days leading up to the graduation were agonizing. The air in our house felt thick with unspoken intentions. Harper spent hours locked in her bedroom typing on her laptop. She refused to let me review the draft of her valedictory speech. She claimed she wanted it to be a surprise. The coastal humidity blanketed the city as the final week of May arrived. The looming collision with my parents and the terrifying uncertainty of Harper's speech merged into a suffocating tension. I had spent 13 years building a secure fortress to protect us from the toxicity of Ardsley Park. I was about to walk into a public auditorium where the gates of that fortress would be thrown wide open. The commencement ceremony was no longer a celebration of academic excellence. It had evolved into a high-stakes theater of war, and the primary combatants were actively taking their seats. The morning of the commencement ceremony arrived with a thick coastal fog that clung to the Spanish moss in the historic district. The humidity was already stifling by 8 in the morning. We drove to the Magnet Academy in silence. Harper sat in the passenger seat wearing her crisp, tailored white dress. She held a single black graduation gown folded neatly across her lap. She did not display any typical teenage anxiety. She projected the calm, focused energy of an auditor preparing to deliver a devastating financial report. I parked my car in the crowded lot and we walked toward the massive brick auditorium. Harper peeled away to join the staging area for the graduating class. I merged into the stream of parents and relatives entering the main doors. The auditorium was heavily air-conditioned, but the atmosphere felt impossibly dense. The space was filled with the affluent families of Savannah. I recognized several local attorneys and corporate executives who frequently employed my forensic accounting firm. I navigated the center aisle looking for an unobtrusive seat. I glanced toward the front of the auditorium and stopped walking. The suffocating anxiety I had suppressed for weeks hit me with physical force. Brenda and William were already seated in the absolute center of the front row. They had clearly arrived an hour early to secure the most prominent position in the room. Brenda wore a pale pink linen suit and a string of authentic pearls. Her blonde hair was styled immaculately. William sat beside her in a tailored gray blazer. They looked like the quintessential pillars of Southern society. They were actively holding court. The school principal stood near their seats, leaning down to chat with them. I watched Brenda smile warmly and place her hand over her heart in a gesture of profound, humble pride. She was projecting the image of a devoted matriarch. I could not hear their exact words over the ambient noise of the crowd, but the body language was unmistakable. Brenda was charming the administration. I watched William shake the principal's hand. He nodded solemnly and adjusted his blazer. I knew exactly what narrative they were spinning. They were actively claiming credit for Harper's massive academic success. They were likely implying to the principal that their generational wealth and strict family standards had provided the foundation for the valedictorian. They were erasing my 13 years of grueling single motherhood. They were erasing the delayed state stipends, the desperate sale of my reliable car, and the midnight forensic audits I performed with an infant sleeping under my desk. They were stealing the narrative of my survival to bolster their own social standing. Drop your city below if you have ever watched someone take credit for your hard work. I felt a sudden, nauseating mix of rage and profound alienation. I could have marched down the center aisle and demanded they vacate the seats. I could have loudly informed the principal that the people sitting in the front row had formally severed ties with the valedictorian over a decade ago. I could have created a massive public spectacle. But I am a professional who deals in calculated logic. A public screaming match would only validate Brenda's long-standing claim that I was unstable. It would ruin Harper's moment and feed the local gossip network for months. I forced myself to walk past the first 2 rows. I found an empty seat in the 3rd row directly behind them. I sat down and stared at the back of my mother's pristine blonde hair. The physical proximity was agonizing. I could smell her expensive floral perfume. I watched her turn slightly to greet a prominent Historical Society board member seated across the aisle. Brenda spoke in a hushed, reverent tone about the brilliant mind of her granddaughter. She used the word granddaughter with smooth, practiced ease. She weaponized the biological title she had previously discarded as a toxic liability. She was performing a masterclass in social manipulation. She was banking on my silence to maintain the facade. She assumed my desire to protect Harper would prevent me from exposing the lie. The auditorium lights began to dim. The low hum of polite conversation faded into expectant silence. The graduation march began to play through the massive overhead speakers. The 8th grade class filed down the side aisles wearing their black gowns. Harper walked near the front of the line. She moved with steady, deliberate steps. She did not look around the room for familiar faces. She kept her eyes focused on the wooden podium resting in the center of the stage. The students took their seats in the reserved section. The principal approached the microphone to deliver the opening remarks. I watched Brenda lean forward in her chair. She adjusted her posture to ensure the event photographer would capture her attentive profile. The principal spoke about the rigorous academic standards of the Magnet Academy and the bright future of the graduating class. She then transitioned to the keynote introduction. She spoke highly of the student who had secured the highest cumulative grade point average in the history of the institution. She praised Harper's quiet dedication and fierce intellect. Brenda nodded in agreement, performing the role of the proud sponsor. The principal called Harper's name. The auditorium erupted in polite applause. Harper stood up from her chair and walked toward the podium. She carried a single sheet of paper and a small folded square of heavy cream cardstock. She stepped behind the wooden stand and adjusted the microphone down to her height. She looked out across the sea of 300 faces. She did not look at me sitting in the third row. Her dark, observant eyes locked onto the exact center of the front row. She stared directly at Brenda. The suffocating anxiety in my chest morphed into a sharp, terrifying clarity. I remembered Jillian's warning in the corporate office. I remembered the specific legal questions about public disclosure laws. I realized the white tailored dress was not chosen for a celebration. It was chosen for an execution. Harper was not standing at the podium to deliver a generic speech about academic potential. She was standing there to detonate a 13-year-old lie. The silent dread I had felt when I left the filing cabinet unlocked was fully realized. The combatants were in position, and my 13-year-old daughter was about to launch the first devastating strike. Harper adjusted the microphone one final time. The auditorium was completely silent. 300 affluent parents and local professionals waited for standard inspirational rhetoric. Harper looked directly at the front row. She did not clear her throat or offer a nervous smile. She began her speech with the cold precision of a lead prosecutor delivering an opening statement. She thanked the faculty for their instruction. She thanked the school board for maintaining the rigorous academic environment of the Magnet Academy. She delivered the required pleasantries with a flat, emotionless tone. Then she set her single sheet of standard paper aside. She picked up the folded square of heavy cream cardstock. She unfolded the thick paper slowly. The crisp sound echoed through the microphone. I sat in the third row, paralyzed by absolute shock. The room felt suspended in a terrifying vacuum. Harper looked up from the paper. She stated she wanted to dedicate her valedictory address to the concept of family lineage. The phrase hung in the air. I saw Brenda sit up slightly straighter in her front row seat. She likely assumed Harper was about to deliver a glowing tribute to her heritage. Brenda was preparing to absorb the public praise she had arrived to collect. Harper did not offer praise. She offered a verified historical document. Harper stated that the true foundation of her success was not built on inherited wealth or social prestige. She announced that her foundation was built on a deliberate choice made 13 years ago. She looked directly at Brenda again. Harper told the audience she wanted to share a piece of private correspondence sent to her mother on the week of her adoption. She raised the cream paper and began to read. She did not yell. She did not inject dramatic flair or angry inflection into her voice. She read the words with chilling, clinical detachment. She read the meticulous cursive handwriting aloud. She projected the elegant, brutal syntax of Southern high society into the massive auditorium. She read the paragraph where Brenda described a ward of the state as an insurmountable betrayal. She read the clinical assessment detailing how a foster child was a permanent, toxic liability to their carefully constructed lineage. The ambient temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The polite, supportive smiles on the faces of the Historical Society women seated nearby began to falter. The parents of the elite student body shifted uncomfortably in their padded seats. They were suddenly trapped in the middle of a vicious, unmasked family demolition. Harper did not stop. She continued reading the exact words Brenda had written to justify her rejection. She read the paragraph formally revoking my status as a daughter. She spoke the sentence demanding I never return to the Ardsley Park address. The silence in the auditorium was no longer expectant. It was suffocating. I watched the back of my mother's head. Brenda was frozen. Her pristine blonde bob remained perfectly still, but her shoulders, rigid and tight, betrayed the massive internal panic. She could not stand up and scream that it was a lie. Harper was holding the physical evidence on a stage in front of the entire Savannah social registry. Harper reached the final section of the letter. She did not spare my father. She read the postscript detailing the $10,000 cashier's check drawn from his commercial bank. She explicitly stated the money was labeled as a final severance payment designed to purchase our absence. She read the exact numerical value of the bribe. The revelation of the specific financial transaction was the lethal blow. In the affluent circles of coastal Georgia, social cruelty can sometimes be ignored or rationalized as private family friction. However, formalizing the abandonment of an infant with a corporate severance check was an undeniable, grotesque violation of their polished moral code. The Historical Society board member seated across the aisle from Brenda turned her head slowly. She looked at my mother with an expression of undisguised revulsion. Other prominent local attorneys and business executives began to whisper among themselves. The hushed, frantic conversations created a low buzzing sound that rippled through the auditorium rows. They were connecting the dots. They realized the proud, devoted grandmother performing for the principal an hour ago was a complete fabrication. They recognized that the woman sitting in the center of the front row had attempted to buy her way out of a biological relationship to protect her country club status. Harper folded the cream paper. She placed it carefully on the wooden podium. She looked out at the audience. She stated that her mother had torn the $10,000 check into pieces and raised her using only the capital she earned tracing corporate fraud. Harper told the crowd she did not achieve the highest grade point average in the academy because of a superior genetic lineage. She stated she achieved it because her mother taught her how to survive when the people who are supposed to protect you decide you are a liability. She concluded her address by thanking me for choosing her when her own blood relatives chose their zip code. She stepped away from the podium. The reaction from the audience was chaotic. It was not a standing ovation. It was a disjointed, scattered applause mixed with stunned silence. Several teachers stood up and clapped loudly, acknowledging the sheer bravery of the speech. The affluent parents clapped politely while continuing to whisper to their neighbors. They were desperate to process the massive public scandal they had just witnessed. I sat in my seat, completely overwhelmed by the tactical brilliance of my 13-year-old daughter. She had not engaged in a petty middle school cafeteria fight. She had waited for the largest possible platform and executed a flawless character assassination using her grandmother's own weapon. I looked at the front row. William was staring at his shoes. His face was flushed dark red. He looked like a man who wanted to disappear into the floorboards. Brenda was gripping her small designer clutch purse with white-knuckled intensity. Her carefully constructed social fortress had just been reduced to ash in under 4 minutes. The graduation ceremony concluded abruptly. The principal rushed through the final diploma distributions, attempting to restore order to the fractured event. The students marched out of the auditorium to the sound of the recessional music. The audience began to stand up and filter toward the main exit doors. The real confrontation was no longer contained to the wooden podium. The massive crowd of parents and local elite were forced to navigate the aisles and confront the reality of the front row. The social isolation Brenda had terrified me with 13 years ago was about to be turned directly against her. The coastal elite despise being manipulated. They had just been forced to watch a public execution of one of their own gatekeepers. The aftermath of the ceremony would not be a quiet exit to the parking lot. It was about to become a devastating social reckoning on the manicured lawn of the Magnet Academy. The heavy wooden doors of the auditorium pushed open. The humid coastal air washed over the crowd of departing families. I walked down the brick pathway alongside Harper. The usual post-graduation celebrations were strangely muted. Parents gathered on the manicured lawn, speaking in hushed tones. They glanced in our direction and offered polite, respectful nods. Nobody approached us to offer hollow congratulations. They gave us a wide berth of cautious reverence. The affluent residents of Savannah had just witnessed a brutal dismantling of their own social hierarchy. They were terrified of stepping into the blast radius. I saw Brenda pushing her way through the sea of black graduation gowns. William trailed several paces behind her, looking entirely defeated. Brenda did not possess her usual regal posture. Her pale pink linen suit looked rumpled, and her breathing was rapid and shallow. She intercepted us near a giant live oak tree. The Spanish moss hung low around us, creating a shaded pocket on the lawn. She stepped directly into Harper's path. Brenda did not offer an apology for her 13 years of silence. She offered a frantic, desperate justification. She spoke rapidly, with a trembling voice. She told Harper about the rusted trailer park in Waycross. She described the crushing weight of rural poverty and the sheer terror of social invisibility. Brenda claimed she wrote that letter to protect the family from sliding back into destitution. She insisted she was trying to save me from a life of financial ruin. She framed her abandonment as an act of harsh maternal protection. She begged Harper to understand the generational trauma that forced her hand. She was performing for the few lingering society members watching from the sidewalk. She hoped her tragic backstory would excuse her cruelty. Harper listened to the frantic explanation. She did not roll her eyes or raise her voice. She displayed the same terrifying clinical detachment she used on the podium. Harper reached into the pocket of her white tailored dress. She pulled out the folded square of heavy cream cardstock. She held it out toward her grandmother. Brenda reached for it, assuming it was a gesture of reconciliation. She took the paper with a trembling hand. Harper told her she could keep it. Harper stated she did not need the original document anymore. Harper informed Brenda that the paper she was holding was just a photocopy. She stated she had made the duplicate 6 months ago in our utility room. Brenda looked down at the folded paper in deep confusion. I felt a sudden shift in the atmosphere. I realized my daughter had executed a strategy far more extensive than a single public speech. Harper explained that she had utilized the local public records database. She had compiled the home mailing addresses of every single active board member of the Savannah Historical Society. Harper told Brenda she had visited the downtown post office early that morning. She had mailed 30 photocopies of the Severance letter to the most prominent women in Chatham County. She did not just expose Brenda to a captive audience. She ensured the physical evidence of her cruelty was currently sitting in the metal mailboxes of the entire coastal elite. The public execution was not a temporary spectacle. It was a permanent, documented fact. Brenda stared at her granddaughter in sheer, unadulterated horror. The color drained entirely from her face. Her carefully constructed social fortress crumbled into dust right in front of us. Harper turned away from the woman who had labeled her a toxic liability. She looked at me and said she was ready to go home. We walked away from the shade of the live oak tree. We left Brenda standing on the lawn, clutching a worthless piece of copied paper. We walked to my car and drove out of the academy parking lot. I did not feel a triumphant surge of joy. I felt a hollow vindication. The 13-year war was finally over. We drove back to our quiet brick house on the edge of the historic district. The adrenaline faded, leaving a deep, profound exhaustion in my bones. Jillian arrived at our front door the following afternoon. She carried a bakery box and a fresh cup of iced tea. She walked into the kitchen and sat at the laminate table. She possessed a wide, knowing smile. Jillian had not attended the graduation, but she had spent her morning listening to the frantic gossip echoing through the downtown law firms. She informed me the social fallout had occurred with ruthless efficiency. The coastal elite operate on strict rules of decorum. They can tolerate quiet indiscretions, but they punish public humiliation without mercy. The president of the Historical Society had approached Brenda later that same afternoon. She used the polite, passive-aggressive tone native to Southern aristocrats. She complimented Brenda's pink linen suit. She then suggested Brenda might want to step down from the executive board to focus on her complicated, private family matters. It was not a suggestion. It was a formal eviction from the only world Brenda valued. The other prominent women quickly followed suit. They stopped returning her phone calls and quietly removed her from their charity luncheon guest lists. Jillian reported that William suffered his own quiet collapse. His cowardly refusal to defend his daughter had bought him nothing but public disgrace. The local business leaders who had witnessed the graduation speech withdrew their social invitations. He was trapped in the sprawling Victorian home in Ardsley Park. He was isolated, with a wife who possessed no remaining social capital. The fortress they had built to keep the world out became their permanent prison. I thanked Jillian for the update. She finished her iced tea and gave me a firm, supportive nod before leaving. She knew my perimeter was finally secure. Harper and I sat on our front porch later that evening. The humid summer air settled over the neighborhood. We drank cold water and listened to the cicadas humming in the trees. The fading coastal light cast long shadows across the wooden floorboards. I looked at my daughter. I asked her why she mailed the letters to the board members. Harper took a slow sip of her drink. She told me an auditor never relies on a single verbal report. She stated an auditor always secures a verifiable paper trail. I looked at my 13-year-old daughter with profound respect. I realized my fierce independence had not just protected her from harm, it had forged her into an unbreakable force. We did not need hidden trust funds or prestigious lineages to secure our future. We had built our own foundation, using resilience and undeniable truth. The trauma of the past was permanently archived. We watched the sun set over Savannah, knowing our lives were entirely our own. The years following that graduation ceremony were quiet and steady. Harper went on to dominate her high school classes and secure a full academic scholarship to a prestigious university far from the Georgia coast. We never heard from Brenda or William again after that afternoon. They faded into the background of a city that had formally rejected their elitist posturing. Looking back at the heavy cream letter and the torn severance check, I realized the deepest truth about family. True lineage is not inherited through bloodlines or wealthy zip codes. It is built through the deliberate choices you make when the world demands you surrender. Family is the person who holds you close in a broken transit vehicle during a suffocating summer heat wave. My father offered me a secret college fund in exchange for my silent compliance. He mistakenly believed that untraceable capital could mask his profound cowardice. I learned that day that money offered in the dark is never a genuine gift. It is a heavy leash. Financial independence is the only impenetrable shield against toxic relatives who view human relationships as sterile corporate transactions. You must be willing to endure the poverty of a cramped apartment to secure the psychological freedom of your children. We survived the brutal heat waves and the delayed government stipends because we refused to compromise our dignity for a hidden bank account. Brenda stood under the dripping Spanish moss and tried to use her childhood trauma to excuse her calculated cruelty. She weaponized her past destitution to justify abandoning an innocent infant. Trauma might explain why a terrified person builds a fortress of deceit, but it never entitles them to lock you inside it. You are never obligated to absorb the toxic behavior of your parents simply because they suffered before you were born. True healing always requires taking personal accountability. Brenda chose a prominent historical society over her own flesh. She earned the isolated silence of her final years. Harper taught me the final and most profound lesson of our long defensive war. She showed me that true justice does not require dramatic screaming matches or bitter public debates. The most lethal defense against a fabricated social narrative is verifiable empirical data. A determined liar can easily manipulate a whispered rumor, but they cannot argue with a photocopied document distributed directly to their peers. Harper did not seek emotional revenge against her grandmother. She sought permanent systemic transparency. She stepped aside and let the raw, unvarnished truth do all the heavy lifting. We built our own secure foundation using nothing but fierce resilience and rigid forensic logic. If you are currently sitting in the shadow of a family ecosystem that views your life choices as a liability, please remember that you have the power to write your own conclusion. You do not need their conditional validation to construct an extraordinary reality. Thank you for listening to this journey on Maya Tells Stories. Please earnestly subscribe to the channel so you can continue to follow other captivating narratives from